So I'm very happy to present some results that emerge from our research that we did within the sub-project C06, streaming series, spatial stories and production regime in Afronovelas, where I worked together with the PhD candidate, Desirability, and several students' assistants. So yeah, in recent decades, television series has emerged and very influential mass media forms with broad audiences driven by a dynamic and rapidly evolving industry in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. And that is where I'd like to take you from, now Korea to West Africa. That is our team. And yeah, so in this communication, I want to talk about a series belonging to this genre of soap opera that depicts everyday family stories that thematize current, sometimes controversial social issues in the stories of the main characters. The soap opera is a particular genre. I mean, you all know it. You all had to, at some points, watch some, and maybe some of you love to watch some still. And this is a particular genre because for two reasons. It's a project where we can escape from our everyday life and where we learn to cope with everyday life. As such, they function as open spaces for the imagination of other possible life worlds. Soap operas convey concrete projection of successful life within, in our case, the West African metropolises. As such, they are telling not only stories, but really spatial stories, to borrow the concept from de Certeau, that the spatial stories tell us a lot about the way subjects are constituted with space in the course of the refiguration of West African cities. And what I want to do today is to tackle the question, how is this aspirational, this desirability spatially designed within the Afronovelas, and who are behind the scene or behind the mise en scène, whose spatial imaginaries of a successful life in West Africa are negotiated and materially set on or stage on set. It is an interesting object of research for thinking about the designing of refiguration. The series makers are investing our imaginaries by conveying a myriad of ways of living. And as such, to paraphrase Mbembe, they are participating to this enclosure of the world. They provoke dynamic of the eruption, and I'm quoting, the emergence, the advent of something new, the blossoming, as a vision of promising future of urban homemaking. The decolonizing power of the Afronovelas, as have been noticed by several authors, Savadogo, but also Desirability, they are replacing the miserabilist view of Africa, visually conveyed for decades in different media, and showing instead a thriving and flourishing everyday life in the West African metropolises, and more precisely inside their homes. They are, maybe we could say, they are fictionally constructing the city yet to come. And yet, by creating a very specific vision of what shall be a desirable future for West African urban living, they are full of blind spot and partiality. The aim of this paper is to socially and materially investigate the production of these stereotypical stories about homemaking told in the Afronovelas, and to understand the implication for the social construction of reality in West African cities. Here a couple of visuals. So that's where I want to take you in the following 25 minutes. I follow an approach in terms of critical cultural sociology. By this, I mean that for me, it's as important to understand the meaningful dimension of the stories told in the series as the production context behind the construction of such desirable anticipation. So not only which stories are told, but by whom are they told. And this through an approach that is sensitive to space, considering not only culture, but also space as constitutive of social. So basically here in this talk is really about, okay, what is actually considered as desirable, as a kind of wishful imagining that would be conveyed by the series, and that are like transmitting this somehow hopeful or optimistic assessment of living in a big city in West Africa. And to do that, I'm actually trying to investigate or analyze what are the spatial stories told by the series. And to do that, I rely on the Sartor concept. And it's really about understanding social processes in space and grasping the different situation in which character represent themselves, identify with themselves, distinguish themselves, or set themselves apart by mobilizing space. And to do that, first, I needed to analyze their spatiality, that is their anchorage in the narrative. I looked at the scenery, the place traveled through, and the spatial reference made at different scale. And then, because dwelling and living means investing space socially and affectively, creating links with individual, place, building, urban forms, and an individual or collective memory, I analyzed the spatial experience of homemaking. That is really the kind of everyday tactics of spatializing home in action. So for that, we followed the characters at their pace through their house, and it was really about trying to understand the spatial stories is trying to understand somehow the moment in which actually the story makes meaning between the characters. That is the creation of a shared sense of home in accordance with a respective subjectivation, thus interweaving the materialization and the symbolization of domestic space. And obviously doing this, I will show you how we did that with the method. But it's really about trying to hold together this material, social, and symbolic dimension together. And yet these different characters that we have been following through their everyday space in the series, they have been imagined, written, played, directed, made up, and so on by someone, actually by a whole team, a whole film team. So that's why, as I said, for me, it's really important to always try to understand, how the kind of stories came up, and for that we're following this an approach in terms of production studies, so that we can understand the position and the positioning within the emerging regime of these different actors that are producing the series. I could, it's not part of the talk, but if there is question to the production regime, I'm very happy to answer them. So what we did series analysis, film analysis basically, and we did several focused ethnographies on the series set in different actually sets in Dakar and in Abidjan over the course of the project, and conducted also a lot of interviews with the different members of the film team, but also with different experts from this emerging regime. So, who is designing desirability? The So it was really interesting somehow to try to understand who is actually selecting, choosing the spaces will be like shoot into. And what is the first remark regarding the particularity of the Senegalese and Ivorian film context is that all the filming takes place in outdoor setting because there is no production facilities so far. There is no big studios or something, so everything has to be actually done in existing places. So it's always about trying to find suitable location to shoot in the immense Dakar metropolis, taking into account contingencies such as light, noise, accessibility, budget, legal vacancies, but also the need for variation because we don't want to repeat the same location through the series. The key player in this process of selection are the locations count. In the course of several interviews, particularly on Go Along with locations count in Dakar, we thought to understand the way in which they somehow represent their city to themselves. There is a common routine of practice, actually, how they do that. So they read the scenario, they make kind of place listing, all the place that they will need for the shooting. And then there is like different methods. Either they call all their friends and know a lot of people, but that's not actually, at some point it comes to the end because then you always fall into the risk of repetition, so they don't want that. And we had a wonderful interview with several of them, but actually one of them saying, yeah, he's basically doing a kind of dérive, so going into some part of the city and like what we might do with, with our students in urban design, and really trying to assess and to find the best location, and basically then ringing the door and say, hey, we're shooting this series. Can we have your house for a week or a month? And what is very interesting is that they read the scenario and then they have a special knowledge. They have a special association with in which kind of space this character should be somehow staged. And that's the very first visual translation that appears, because everything is actually written. In written, there is not many, or not at all actually, visual material used at this stage. So the very first somehow, imagination come from the locations counter. Then he's trying to find different places, one that he think that the director would like, and one that is saying that the producer will found. And so there is always obviously this balance to somehow cope with, that you find, that you can afford them, basically. But what is a good space? So we asked the locations count and other member of the film crew this question relentlessly. So how do you find the good places? And actually, they were unanimous that somehow there were like a very basic economic distinction going on. It was always like a place for rich, a place for average, a place for poor. And there was always like, you look at this, here's for the rich. So that's, and they would always just use this very basic distinction. We made actually, and that would be like what guides them to find the appropriate district where to look for other place. It is rich, average, or poor, or the appropriate building. Obviously, always with this idea that they want to find actually very fascinating houses that can provoke this wow effect, and basically emphasizing the kind of need for very houses that for them in their imagination are actually houses of rich people. And because that's the case, that's the whole thing about Afronovelas, is actually to let the people dream and not to take them back to the very difficult everyday life that they encounter. So we went for a walk. I'm just showing you. We went for a walk with the locations counts through a district in Dakar, which is quite heterogeneous. And he was really saying, look, this is for poor character, this is for average character, this is for a rich character. And he was like really just using this, and for him it was completely clear how he could make this distinction. And then there is obviously like a further category. If you want obviously a house for very rich, then you need a pool. And so they so that was like, then okay, how you access a house with a pool. So that is like the kind of that was the kind of what in all the discussion that we had, we get a bit stuck with this fairly rigid economic distinction. It became a bit like more interesting or more somehow complex when we began to talk about interior design, and then here in this case we were able to witness the filming of a scene in the luxury flat, decorating in the so-called Afro-chic style in emerald green tones with really exceptional furniture that you can see a bit in these different images. And this is what was really described as something exceptionally tasteful, not only rich, but also like with taste. And it appears that it actually turned out to be the flat of a leading Senegalese actress who made it available for the filming. So that was also interesting. That she was not performing in the series that was shot. She was just somehow part of this, obviously, of the scene and making her flat available. What is interesting is that if we were on the ground with the locations counter, trying really to find that the first houses and then obviously integrating into the stories, we were really, like, as I said, stuck with this economic, quite rigid distinction. But then when we go into the series and do the film analysis, it is actually much more differentiated, not only economically, but also in terms of gender, generation, culture, religious practice, and so on. And that is interesting that these criteria were rarely elucidated when we were talking to the film crew, even if they were actually completely part of what they were doing all the time. But as we all know, it's not that easy to describe space. I mean, one director tried during ethnographic observation to describe on the spot this woven link between space and character. So obviously, what the quote that I brought here, we're not going to have the same space for a rich woman living alone as a man with a family. You can see here, and then he did like this. This is clearly a flat of a strong woman. Look here, and then he was like pointing at the painting. It's clear. And yeah, that's interesting because it is obviously then you can see that there is a lot of codes and shared norms that are going on in order to really, assess this alignment. And it presupposes a shared spatial knowledge. What is interesting is that then from this first very categories, economical distinction, then it is really around the one character that the house will be, or the home will be then staged and somehow get a kind of personification. And there is this alignment between characters and houses, between subjectivation and spatial constitution, which is based on a spatial stereotyping of social figures in West African society. So we have like the emancipated artist, the pious, respectful family father, the mother, head of the family, the aspiring maîtresse or lover, etc. So they're all social figures, and they all have like a kind of typical special stories associated to them. The staging of these various often contradictory homes in the soap seems to follow a main narrative, and it's not that not lies between good and evil or right and wrong, like what we know from the Western series, but much more between traditions and modernities. And so the analysis shows that the relationship between fictional subject and their fictional home are constructing along this normative social interpretation of the reinvention of tradition, the decolonization effort toward the West, and the development of multiple differentiated African modernities. So there is this moral negotiation of more traditional or modern or speculative role models, which is conveyed by the series through the spatial staging of aspirational, conventional, as well as challenging characters. And that is where it becomes very interesting that obviously Afronovelas are not just an univocal reflection of West African society. They are really shifting the lines in their stereotyping of divergent subject and producing new subjectivation through the spatialization. And I hope I have still looking at you, just to present you one case study, which is like Pod et Marichou is one of the first Senegalese series in the mid of the 18th that has been a big success, watched by millions of spectators, TV spectators, so it's shot in Dakar. Series tell the story of two young Senegalese who fell in love at first sight. However, their union will not be easy because of their respective past. And in the first episode of the 4th season, the main character, Pod, is a young man divorced from his wife, Marichou, who was remarried with Aladji, a socially well-off man considerably older than her. Pod lives alone with his daughter, Maya, from a previous marriage. And Marichou lives with the new husband. But the two of them, Pod and Marichou, even they are divorced, they are still in love. And obviously it's a soap, so it's all about romance. And there's, always trying to get back together. They're both members of the same social class that is like kind of aspirational upper class. But the spatial stories of the two heroes' homes contrast. They are also very built in opposition to one another. So Pod lives in a ground floor duplex flat in a new building overlooking a quiet residential street. The centerpiece of the home is a kind of bright open-plan kitchen that opens into a loggia. This is the living room where Pod fulfills his role as parents. He serves breakfast here to his daughter Maya. He looks after his daughter's studies, phone Marichou to discuss work issue, and so on. So this is a living space that is like accessible and also to the immediate neighbors through an internal door that opens into the central corridor of the building. So that's very interesting. It's a kind of very open houses and you can really see that in different scenes where the neighbors are coming in, going away, and so on. So that's quite porous. And it's actually completely reproducing in a kind of reinvention the traditional dwelling of the compound, like around the courtyard, that you can also find a lot. In the case of actually Aladji, so that's the other man, the flat is organized completely differently with a much more hierarchical structure of ceremonial and service spaces. So there is clearly in the series spaces that are visible and other that remain invisible, but we can imagine that they are there because we hear, oh, I'm just coming from you can somehow get an imagination of that, but you don't see them. And there is really this visible room, the dining room, the living room, that's like a kind of receptional room where Aladji and his wife, Marichou, are dwelling. And then there is like the kitchen, and it's clearly a room where the husband is never going, because then Marichou can call her lovers when she's in the kitchen, so it's clear that she's safe, then he will not come there. Or that the servant, there is like a whole, you can really see the circulation through the house of these different families members. And what becomes clear is that there is spaces that are visible and accessible and somehow representational, and there is like kind of back end basically of the flat. And what is interesting is that it's much more following a kind of Western old bourgeois home, where you have like this, representational spaces, and the spaces like on the back clearly gendered, also who can circulate through which space. And so what is like completely interesting and put everything into balance is that somehow, you have Pot, who is actually much more kind of very speculative, progressive role model, being single dad of a daughter. That is actually in Senegalese society not possible. Normally the man usually remarried or definitely doesn't take care alone of a child, and even especially not if it's a girl. So he is like living this kind of very, quite speculative role model in the traditional compound form. And then on the other hand, you have much more conventional and quite traditional construction of masculinities through the husband of Marichou, Alaji, but then living in a kind of Western reinvention in this high building in completely like quite also cold environment. And so I think that is what is quite interesting, is that these series are really staging very different role model and subjects and associating them to different spatial stories. And it's not following the kind of line that we could assess, or there is the kind of traditional figures living in a traditional houses, and and then on the other hand, we have like the modern, much more modern, maybe if it's an African modernity or a modernity toward Western, and living the kind of modern life. Now it's much more actually entangled and much more difficult than that. And I think that is exactly where we can see this, all the contradiction and the kind of negotiation of this actually tension between traditions and modernities at play. And I think by staging somehow the characters in this way, then obviously soap makers or filmmakers are completely contributing to the production of this kind of stories. I'm finished.
Okay. Thank you.